Verified facts in place. Wyoming statehood, July 10, 1890. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, 1872, and Devil's Gate on the Sweetwater. Writing the full narrative now. Trimming the draft to 2,500 words while preserving emotional beats and verified history. The wind came off the Laramie Plains in late October, dry and patient, carrying sage and distant wood smoke. Ruth Ellison stood at the edge of the Cheyenne Road with her daughter's hand in hers and a carpetbag at her feet, and she tried not to let the child feel how frightened she was. Maggie was 9 years old. She had her father's straight shoulders and her mother's habit of going quiet when the world turned difficult. She looked up the road toward Cheyenne, where the new state capital had risen since Wyoming joined the Union on the 10th of July in 1890, and asked in a small voice whether they would reach the boarding house before supper. Ruth said they would. She did not know if it was true. They had come east along the old overland trail country, past ground where Oregon Trail ruts still cut the earth, and where travelers had once measured hope in miles to Devil's Gate on the Sweetwater River. Ruth's husband, Thomas, had talked about that landmark the way men talked about places that proved a person could survive impossible distances. He had not survived the spring fever that took him in March of 1891, 3 months after the territory became a state, and men in Cheyenne spoke of fresh beginnings the way people speak of weather they cannot control. The Tennant Ranch on the Sweetwater was not theirs to keep. The owner, a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association that had organized cattlemen in Laramie County since 1872, had reclaimed the lease by summer, with paperwork and no room for argument. Ruth had sold the wagon for enough to carry them to Cheyenne and pay 1 month at a boarding house on Ferguson Street. That month ended on a Tuesday. The woman at the boarding house had not unkind eyes, but she had a full house and a reputation to keep, now that Cheyenne was the seat of state government, and strangers arrived on every Union Pacific train that hissed into the depot built in 1887. She said she was sorry. She said perhaps in the spring. Ruth thanked her and walked out with Maggie before the apology became something neither of them could bear. The sun was sliding west. The road was empty between distant riders. Maggie's hand was growing cold. Ruth shifted the carpetbag and told herself there was still light enough to knock on one more door. She did not hear the horse until it was close. The rider slowed, where they stood a tall man on a bay horse with the unhurried posture of someone who did not need to prove he belonged on open land. He looked at the bag, then at Maggie, then at Ruth's face with an attention that was not rude and not pitying. It was thorough, the way a rancher looked at a fence line he intended to mend. "You are a long way from town to be on foot," he said. Ruth lifted her chin. "We are not lost." "I did not say you were." He shifted in the saddle. "I am Caleb Marsh. My ranch sits 3 miles north on the creek. You look like women who have spent the day being told there is no room." Maggie pressed closer to her mother's skirt. Ruth would not cry in front of a stranger. She had made that decision at Thomas's graveside and kept it through every hard mile since. "We have money for supper in town," she said, though the money was counted in coins now, and the arithmetic was cruel. Caleb looked toward Cheyenne, then back at them. "Town will still be there after supper," he said. "Ride back to my ranch and eat." It was not a question dressed as kindness. It was an offer set down plain the way you set down a plate for someone too proud to ask and too hungry to refuse forever. Ruth opened her mouth to decline it properly. Maggie looked up at the horse with the naked hope of a child who has been brave too long. Ruth heard herself say, "We would be grateful." Caleb dismounted, helped Ruth up first, then lifted Maggie as if she weighed nothing, and swung into the saddle behind them. The bay walked north while the sun turned the grass gold. The Marsh Ranch was low and solid against the open sky, chimney smoke rising into evening. An older woman came onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had Caleb's eyes and a gentler mouth. "This is my mother, Evelyn," Caleb said. "Mother, this is Mrs. Ellison and her daughter. They will take supper with us." Evelyn looked at Ruth one long moment. Then she said, "Then they will want warm water and a place to set that bag," and went inside without another question. That was the first tear Ruth nearly shed, and she caught it the way you catch a door before it slams. In the kitchen, she washed Maggie's face and hands, while Evelyn set out bread and venison stew and canned peaches. The room smelled of coffee and yeast and a hearth used every day for years. Maggie ate until color returned to her cheeks. Caleb said grace without performance. Evelyn asked no personal questions until the plates were cleared, and Maggie was watching the fire with heavy eyes. Then Evelyn said softly, "Who did you lose?" Ruth had not expected the question and could not armor herself against it. "My husband," she said. "Thomas Ellison. Fever. March." Evelyn reached across the table and laid her hand over Ruth's. "Then you know what lonely suppers cost," she said. Ruth's throat tightened. She nodded once. Caleb stood. "There is a room above the tack shed with a bed that does not sag if you stay near the wall," he said. "Stay tonight. The road will not improve after dark." Ruth meant to leave at dawn, but dawn brought coffee, and Evelyn's note that the hens had started late and Maggie was already in the yard talking to an orange barn cat as if she had known it forever. One day became 3 when an autumn storm pinned the sky low, and Ruth could not walk a child into weather that turned the Cheyenne road to mud. She mended shirts, baked bread, and one afternoon found Maggie in the barn on an upturned bucket, telling Thomas's old stories to the cat, as if he might hear them if she spoke clearly enough. Ruth turned away before Maggie saw her face. That evening, after Maggie slept, Evelyn pushed a folded paper across the kitchen table. "Found that in the room when I changed the linens," she said. "Might be it fell from your bed." Ruth opened it with hands that already knew what paper felt like when it held a voice you would never hear again. Thomas had written it 2 winters ago on the Sweetwater, on a night too cold for sensible men to be awake. He wrote that Ruth hummed while she worked, and that Maggie had laughed in her sleep like bells. He wrote that if anything happened to him, Ruth was not to let anyone make her small. He wrote that love was not a room you rented. It was a table you kept setting. Ruth read it twice. The second time, her vision blurred so completely she could not have read it if she tried. Evelyn pretended to be very interested in beet seeds. Ruth folded the letter and held it to her chest until her breathing settled into something that resembled strength. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn said, "Some grief needs witnesses. That is all." On the 4th morning, Ruth packed the carpet bag. Caleb was mending a bridle on the porch. "The stock growers' meeting in Cheyenne is Friday," he said. "I ride in for supplies. You could ride with me and ask after work." They left Maggie with Evelyn and rode 2 hours at an easy walk. Ruth watched the Capitol dome grow and thought of all the men who had come to this town since the Union Pacific first laid headquarters at Crow Creek Crossing in 1867, believing distance could be conquered by rail and will. By noon, 2 respectable employers had politely declined. A dressmaker needed an apprentice, not a widow with a child. A hotel wanted a chambermaid with no dependents. Ruth walked back to the stockyards where cattlemen gathered after Wyoming Stock Growers Association sessions. Her feet ached. Her hope had gone thin. Caleb was waiting with his horse and a steady gray mare on lead. "You found nothing?" he said. "Not today." He was quiet while men passed in broad hats talking of prices and grass. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Influenza. We had a son for 3 days. I know what it is to sit in a full house and still have nowhere that feels like home." Ruth looked at him. He did not flinch. "I am not offering charity," he said. The ranch needs a woman who can cook, mend, and keep books. Evelyn is getting older. Fair wage and the room above the tack shed until you find better. He was not asking her to be his wife. He was asking her to live. I will try, she said. Work on the Marsh Ranch had the rhythm of real need. Ruth rose before light. Maggie learned her letters at the kitchen table. Caleb rode long days checking water and hay. In the evenings, they ate together and talked of feed prices and coyotes and whether the Union Pacific schedule would bring the new minister before Christmas. Ruth kept Thomas's letter in the Bible Evelyn lent her and read it on nights when the wind worried the shutters. December brought cold that lived in the bones. Evelyn's hands stiffened. Ruth wrapped them in warm cloth before breakfast. One morning, Evelyn confessed she had once stood on the Cheyenne Road 50 years earlier, newly widowed, with a baby in her arms, and no place to go, until a rancher heading north offered supper. "Caleb's father?" Ruth asked. "His father was already in the ground," Evelyn said. "A stranger. He brought me to the ranch that became this one. I never saw him again. I have prayed for him every Sunday since." She squeezed Ruth's hands. "When Caleb saw you on the road, he came home and asked if the spare room was clean. I knew what road he had been remembering." Ruth went to the tack shed room and sat on the bed near the wall that did not sag. She cried at last, not the sharp cries of fresh loss, but the slow tears of a woman understood. Maggie found her and climbed into her lap without asking. "Papa would like Mr. Marsh," Maggie said seriously. "He always said good men feed horses before themselves." Ruth laughed through her tears and held her daughter until the room grew still. If you have ever known what it is to be turned away when you needed one safe door, stay with this story a little longer. And if it is touching the tender places in your heart, I would be grateful if you subscribed so we can ride the next road together. Winter loosened in March. Ruth's wages paid for Maggie's shoes and Evelyn's medicine. Ruth kept the ranch books in a hand so neat, the banker in Cheyenne asked who managed the accounts. Town still had eyes. Women at the mercantile grew quiet when Ruth entered. A cattleman at the feed store mentioned Caleb Marsh and a widow, as if the words were a warning. Ruth kept her chin level. She had walked the road once. She would not be walked off it by whispers. Caleb brought Ruth the mail himself after that. Once a letter came addressed to Thomas Ellison at a ranch that no longer existed. He set it on the table without comment and let Ruth decide what to burn. Spring of 1892 arrived yellow and tentative. One evening, after supper, when Maggie had gone to chase the cat through the barn, Caleb stayed at the table while Ruth wiped the dishes dry. "You are not a hired woman to me anymore," he said quietly. "You know that." Ruth's hands stilled. "I know. I would like you to stay as my wife," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else. Because this table is wrong without you at the head of it when my mother naps and Maggie tells stories to the cat. I will ask Maggie when you are ready. I will ask Evelyn, too." Ruth set the plate down carefully. She thought of Thomas's letter and Devil's Gate far to the west, where pioneers had passed through hard country, believing the next mile might hold mercy. She thought of a stranger who once fed Evelyn and disappeared into history like an angel with dust on his boots. "I am ready," she said. He waited until she came around to him, and when she did, he stood and let her choose the moment their fingers met. Maggie said yes, with the fierce simplicity of a child who had watched her mother learn to breathe again. Evelyn cried and swore it was the onions. They married in June at the small church in Cheyenne, with 3 witnesses and no fuss. Maggie wore a calico dress and pinned a sprig of sage to Caleb's coat because she said it smelled like home. Afterward, they rode back north as family. The gray mare walked steady. The Capitol dome faded behind them. Wind moved through the grass in long, gentle waves. That night, Ruth stood on the porch while Caleb banked the stove and Evelyn told Maggie a story in the kitchen. The sky over Laramie County was wide and dark and full of stars. She could not see the Sweetwater from here, or Devil's Gate, or the ruts of the Overland Trail, but she carried them inside her all the miles that had brought her to this porch. She had nowhere left to go, once on a road that looked like every other hard road. A rancher had said, "Ride back and eat supper," and that plain sentence had opened a door she did not know still existed. Love, she understood now, was not only the voice you lost. It was also the hands that set the table after, and the child who learned to laugh again, and the woman who learned she was allowed to stay. Thank you for sharing this evening with Ruth and Caleb and little Maggie. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the kindest offer you ever received when you had nowhere left to go. I read every one. Until the next story, keep your table set and your heart open. There is still mercy on the road.